This lecture is going to be on Egypt, and as you can see here we have a couple different maps here. We have a nice map showing various sites from the different time periods along the Nile River. Here's the Libyan and the Western Desert, the Arabian, sometimes referred to as the Eastern Desert. This particular area is called the Delta, and you can see it over here in this aerial photograph. Quite an expansive area of arable land. But as we move southwards, you can see that area becomes much more circumscripted. But it is the Nile that is the key to the rise of the Egyptian state. What's interesting about this area is that there are quite a different subsistence practices that occur. In fact, all of them pretty much, for hunting and gathering, pastoralism, horticulture, agriculture. Any of this can be done here. Of course, with agriculture, it does take a little bit more, because you need to do some irrigation and flood control and so forth. But you can kind of think of this area down here as an elongated oasis. This actually worked out well for the ancient Egyptians because it provided a type of safety for them. They had the Mediterranean here in the north that was kind of blocking people. They had the Libyan desert here and the Arabian desert over here. And all of those, and in fact in the south, which you can't see on this particular map, are highlands. So that created kind of a buffer against other people. It took a rather long time for other peoples to invade, and that's what allowed the Egyptian state to last for quite a long period of time. But again, to reiterate, the Nile is the key to the rise of the state. It facilitated the movement of peoples, it facilitated the movement of goods, and also information could be moved relatively rapidly. You could also plan your agriculture as the Nile flooded every spring. Now you couldn't, of course, predict how much the flood would be, but it would flood, so you could plan your agriculture around that. Now in Pleistocene Egypt, it should not come as any surprise that we do see foragers during this particular time frame. Between 20,000 and 11,000 years ago, we do start to see that climatic shift. And of course, this is the same thing that impacted peoples living over in Mesopotamia. Towards the end of this period, we start to see increased sedentism. The best evidence from this particular time frame comes from a series of sites called Khadan, the Khadan sites in Nubia. So this is going to be kind of south of what we think of Egypt today. And these date from 15,000 to 11,000 years ago. And some of the defining characteristics are grinding stones, which indicates a changing relationship with plants. We also find axes and hoes. And we also find cemeteries. What's interesting about the cemeteries is that we do see evidence of conflict among peoples. So if you look at these particular burials, you can see all these little pencils, and they're pointing to arrowheads and spearheads that are actually embedded in bone. At the site of Jabal Sahaba, there's a burial pit with 15 individuals, and that's what this picture is actually from, is the site of Jabal Sahaba. At Nabta Playa, we're starting to see that transition into the Holocene, and so 11,000 to 6.5 thousand years ago. And we'll see a mix of foraging and pastoralism. So at Nabta Playa, we find domestic cattle by 9.3 thousand years ago. They're relatively small seasonal camps, but we do start to see some ceramics. However, these are not made in the area, they're imported in. So that long distance connection probably up in the Palestinian area or the Levant, as we learned about last week. After 9.3 thousand years ago, we have long-term settlement. We have indications of a fairly complex social system emerging. We have structures that are both subterranean and built on the surface. We have burials, and these are kind of interesting. They're clay-lined and roofed burial chambers, but we see young cows that are sacrificed and put in these. So again, some changing social things going on here. We also have possible astronomical structure here. It might be one of the oldest ones. It does seem to be lined up with the summer solstice. By 8.8 thousand years ago in this particular area, they were making their own pottery, and by about 8.1 thousand years ago, we see sheep and goats introduced from Southwest Asia. And you can see Nabta Playa here on this map of Egypt. Next site we want to talk about the Dakhla Oasis, and here we do have stone-based huts, so we actually have some foundations of stone. The earliest habitation is about 400,000 years ago, but it's between 9,000 and 8,500 years ago that we see kind of substantial habitation, and again these stone-based huts. Now we do have square and circular patterns, and they're different sizes, so some of them could have been structures, and then some of them camping tents or the remains of camping tents. Some actually have flagstone floors, so putting that much labor into something is pretty much evidence that you're going to stay there for a while. What's interesting, if you look and see where Dakhla Oasis is on this particular map, right here, it's not really close to any of the riverine resources or any of the seas, but we do see increased aquatic resources from this particular site. And then we also have a bunch of grinding stones here in this particular picture. So lots of different things going on here, but we are seeing a trend in the intensification of resource use. And this is going to be some of the origins of farming, which really emerges in the early Khartoum period around 8,000 years ago. And here we see wheat and barley. Both of these are imported plants. They're not native to the area. But we also see flax, which is native to the area, being cultivated. And we also start to see pottery. And again, if we're going to have wheat and barley, storage usually comes along with that, and hence the pottery. We see cattle, we see sheep, goats, pigs, we even have dogs. So all of these are domesticated animals that are in use by 7,000 years ago. Some people have suggested that this was actually a planned, or that there were planned settlements, particularly at the site of Merimdi. And this is because we do find the remnants of mud huts along very narrow lanes, so it looks like somebody was planning ahead, laying out the community itself. So you can see Merimdi over here, up in the Delta region, then the Fayum Oasis over here, and again, here's a little water source. We actually can document the transition from hunting and gathering to an agricultural-based society in this particular region. So we find grain storage silos, we find sickles, we find grinding stones. But what's interesting at Fayum is we actually don't find a lot of evidence of long-term occupation. So it looks like people were coming back and using this at different times of the year. So that's kind of unusual, but we can see that still that transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture. So it's this time frame between 7,000 and 6,000 years ago that we see this move to full-scale agriculture. And pretty much by 6,000 years ago, we find full-scale agriculture over most of Egypt. From this point on, we do see quite a mix of subsistence foods. The foods they're actually eating. So we have wheat, barley, we have lentils, we have beans, we have melons, figs, cucumbers, onions. There are sheep, there are goats, there's cattle, fish, ducks, geese, turtles. And then some things that they weren't eating. We have rushes, flax, papyrus. We find copper, gold, silver, different kinds of building stones. So lots of stuff going on as people begin to settle down. We also see evidence that crocodiles and hippos become relatively important to the people, and that makes sense living along the Nile itself. So again, this